She vanished on a hike. Days later, her dog was found tied to a tree, but she wasn't. The man seen with her? Calm, older, walking a red-furred dog. What no one knew was that he lived in a van, hunted in forests, and confessed to murder with zero emotion. He called it necessary. But what was he still hiding, and how many more are out there? Her body was found in the Apalachicola National Forest, hidden beneath a loose scattering of pine needles and decaying leaves. The torso was partially exposed, naked, decomposing, and mutilated. Her head and hands were missing. The limbs showed signs of stiff resistance, deep contusions around the wrists, and sharp post-mortem incisions made with a serrated edge. There were no drag marks, no signs of struggle nearby. The body had been placed there deliberately, post-mortem, in a position suggesting concealment over ritual. It was clear this was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was staged. The victim was later identified as Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse and Sunday school teacher who had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. Her car had been found abandoned off Highway 319 with the gas cap open. Investigators found her driver's license still inside the glove compartment, untouched. Her cell phone was never recovered. 3 days after her disappearance, surveillance footage captured a man using Cheryl's ATM card. His face was obscured by a crude mask, fashioned from cloth and plastic, cut irregularly, covering his features completely. He wore gloves. He looked directly at the camera without hesitation. The ATM keypad bore no fingerprints. Forensic analysis revealed minimal blood at the disposal site, confirming that the mutilation had occurred elsewhere. The dismemberment was systematic. The head and hands were intentionally removed to prevent identification, a technique that, at the time, suggested either a highly experienced killer or one with a basic understanding of forensic processes. The precision of the cuts, especially around the joints, indicated the use of a serrated hunting knife. No defensive wounds on the torso suggested the victim had either been unconscious or already dead during dismemberment. Patterns began to emerge. This was not a random act. There was evidence of control, of forethought, and, more disturbingly, of patience. Behavioral profiling pointed to a perpetrator who felt comfortable in isolated, wooded environments, someone who preferred victims with a specific vulnerability profile, alone, approachable, and mobile. Witnesses recalled seeing a middle-aged white male with a scruffy beard and a reddish dog in the area where Cheryl was last seen. They described him as polite, quiet, and camping off-grid. The man was never aggressive, never alarming. He was just present. The dog, described consistently as medium-sized with reddish fur, became the most identifiable constant. In each witness account, the dog was off-leash but obedient, often lingering near the man as he spoke with hikers or rested near trailheads. The presence of the dog softened the man's image, made him seem less threatening, even approachable. This was not coincidental. In criminal behavioral terms, this suggests a manipulator who actively curated his persona to reduce suspicion. The dog served a dual function: companionship and camouflage. At this point in the investigation, law enforcement had no name, only a composite sketch built from vague descriptions and a few digital clues. But even then, a psychological profile was forming. The subject was male, likely over 50, nomadic, intelligent, but underachieving, likely with a military or survivalist background, and experienced in navigating rural environments. His reliance on public ATMs, yet refusal to leave physical evidence, demonstrated low impulse control paired with high spatial awareness. This combination is rare, often seen in offenders who believe they are smarter than the system and have operated below radar for extended periods. There were no signs of sexual assault, no personal items stolen, and no known connection between Cheryl and the unknown male. The motive, at least on the surface, wasn't sexual gratification or revenge. It was control, total and irreversible. The removal of the head and hands wasn't just about avoiding identification. It was about erasure, a complete removal of identity, of autonomy, of witness. That level of depersonalization points toward an offender who does not view his victims as individuals, but as objects to be used and discarded. This is characteristic of a person with deep antisocial traits, possibly narcissistic or schizoid tendencies, who has learned to dissociate emotional attachment from violent behavior. The crime scene offered no evidence of remorse, no message, no symbolism. Just clinical violence, stripped of emotion, carried out in silence. The forest absorbed the scream. No one heard it. The man with the dog vanished into the woods, unknown, unnoticed, unaccounted for. But the precision of his act raised an inevitable question. Was this his first kill, or just the first one found? He moved through national forests like a ghost, visible to hikers for moments, then gone. Always on foot, sometimes in a white Chevrolet Astro van outfitted with survival gear, tools, and a mattress in the back. He camped near trailheads, but never in designated campsites. He stayed on the outskirts of campgrounds, just close enough to observe others, just far enough to avoid detection. His behavior followed a pattern of transient autonomy, one marked by a preference for unregulated space, minimal contact, and a complete rejection of routine structure. Witnesses described a man in his 60s, gaunt, with thinning hair and hollow eyes, often seen walking with a reddish retriever mix. The dog served as a social buffer, disarming, familiar, a distraction. Most described him as quiet, harmless, even kind. These traits align with offenders who rely on manufactured normalcy to bypass social defenses. There was no overt menace, no visible instability, but always the sense of someone who didn't quite belong. His strategy for survival was rudimentary but calculated. He stole just enough money to buy gas, canned food, and dog supplies. He scavenged from dumpsters behind grocery stores and camped near rivers for fresh water. He maintained no fixed address, used no cell phone, and left behind no digital footprint. Every movement was analog, untraceable. This level of operational awareness suggests a learned criminal methodology, honed through experience rather than formal education. It also points to a high tolerance for discomfort, a key trait in long-term predatory offenders who operate outside conventional society. In January 2008, the disappearance of 24-year-old Meredith Emerson triggered a coordinated law enforcement response. She was last seen hiking the Blood Mountain Trail in northern Georgia with her dog, a black Labrador named Ella. Multiple hikers recalled a man walking near her, older, with a red dog. The man was seen circling back several times, pacing behind Meredith at an irregular distance. When she failed to return home, her car was found in the parking lot, keys still inside, leash on the seat. Ella was found days later, alone but unharmed, tied to a tree near a rural road. Search efforts intensified. As investigators cross-referenced prior missing persons cases, similarities became difficult to ignore. In each case, the victim had been hiking or camping alone. The perpetrator had vanished without a trace, and the surrounding environment had made forensic recovery nearly impossible. Moreover, the consistent appearance of a red-furred dog accompanying a middle-aged male became the first behavioral link between the cases. The choice of location, national forests, was not arbitrary. These were liminal spaces, areas with minimal surveillance, sparse population density, and complex terrain. They offered both concealment and opportunity. In this environment, the offender retained the advantage. He knew the land, moved without restriction, and chose his victims based on vulnerability and predictability. Hikers traveling alone, particularly females, were ideal targets. The risk of confrontation was low, escape routes were many, and the isolation guaranteed time for prolonged control. This approach reveals a fundamental trait of the subject: impulse suppression. Rather than acting on sudden rage or fantasy, the offender operated with restraint, waiting for the right circumstances to present themselves. This behavioral consistency, combined with deliberate preparation and a clear victim profile, indicates organized offender typology with antisocial traits and possible sadistic elements, particularly in the methodical manipulation and disposal of bodies. In Meredith's case, the subject employed a false pretense of camaraderie, engaging her in casual trail conversation, possibly commenting on their dogs. Once he gained proximity and assessed the absence of nearby witnesses, he struck. Evidence from later testimony revealed he used blunt force to subdue her, zip ties to restrain her, and then moved her to several locations over the course of 3 days. His delay in killing her suggests a need for extended control, not just over the victim's body, but over the entire narrative of her disappearance. This psychological need to dominate time and circumstance is telling. He didn't simply kill, he erased, he redirected. He made her absence feel gradual, uncertain. The emotional chaos inflicted on family and law enforcement was, in itself, a form of control. When Meredith's body was eventually discovered, hidden, decapitated, and cleaned of trace DNA, it confirmed what behavioral indicators had long suggested. The killer was meticulous, mobile, and deeply disconnected from empathy. He navigated rural terrain with precision, understood forensic delay, and adapted to shifting risk factors without compromising his ritual. At this point in the investigation, the link between Cheryl Dunlap and Meredith Emerson had not yet been confirmed, but the signs were converging. The forests had spoken twice, and both times there had been a man with a red dog, watching, waiting. The critical question now remained: how many others had passed him on the trail? Without knowing how close they came to vanishing, Gary Michael Hilton did not rush. His method of control was incremental, psychological first, physical second. In the case of Meredith Emerson, he maintained dominance not through overt brutality, but through calculated restraint. He allowed her to believe, at least momentarily, that cooperation could preserve her life. This illusion of hope is common in predatory offenders who seek more than a kill. They seek submission. The act of prolonging a victim's life serves a dual purpose. It reinforces the offender's sense of omnipotence and delays the irreversible, buying more time to stage the endgame with precision. Evidence shows Hilton held Meredith for approximately 3 days. During that time, he moved her between remote locations, avoided populated areas, and used manipulation rather than force to keep her compliant. He provided minimal food and water. He refrained from overt torture, but maintained total control through confinement, threats, and unpredictability. According to his later confession, she fought back early, struggled, attempted escape, even disarmed him momentarily. Her resistance, however, did not provoke a frenzied reaction. Instead, it triggered strategic recalibration. This ability to adjust in real time is notable. It reflects high cognitive function under stress, a quality rarely seen in impulsive offenders. Hilton was not reacting emotionally. He was adapting to a variable in his plan. The shift from an immediate kill to a drawn-out captivity suggests a deep-seated need for procedural domination. Every hour she remained alive was, in his mind, a reinforcement of power. He eventually extracted her ATM code, not through violence, but through persistence. Once the code was confirmed through a test withdrawal, her fate was sealed. According to forensic timelines, she was killed shortly thereafter in a wooded area. Hilton admitted to using a tire jack handle to strike her skull. He claimed it was quick, a term that reveals his internal rationalization. To him, it was humane, efficient, necessary. Post-mortem actions were deliberate. He decapitated the body, cleaned the remains to remove DNA, and left the corpse in a concealed area of the forest. The head was placed in a separate location, later discovered in a black plastic bag. He used bleach and gloves. These behaviors point to forensic awareness, enough to delay identification, though not sophisticated enough to eliminate all traces. When arrested days later, found cleaning his van at a gas station, dog still present, Hilton presented as cooperative. He quickly entered negotiations, information in exchange for a life sentence rather than capital punishment. This act was not out of remorse, but strategic survival. His confession was methodical, free of emotion, and framed with pragmatic detachment. He recounted locations, times, tools used, each detail offered like a transaction. Yet, there were gaps, inconsistencies in his memory, selective omissions. Certain time frames were vague. When pressed about other possible victims, he deflected. "You already have enough to kill me," he said once, when asked directly if there were more bodies. This response is telling. It implies finality, but not denial. Hilton's manipulation extended into the interrogation room. He adjusted his tone, shifted blame to circumstance, and occasionally referred to his crimes as mistakes or bad choices, language that minimizes intent. He never referred to the victims by name unless prompted. They were abstractions, roles in a sequence of events designed and executed by him. He exhibited no signs of psychosis. His memory was intact. His reasoning was linear. He did not display remorse, nor did he attempt to glorify his actions. Instead, he occupied a space of moral vacancy, detached but lucid. This psychological profile fits the structure of an organized, mission-driven killer with antisocial personality traits and a functional but eroded sense of interpersonal empathy. The predator's game did not end with the murders. It continued in interviews, courtrooms, and even casual conversations with cellmates. He maintained control as long as possible, even when physically restrained. For him, the absence of freedom was tolerable, so long as he retained agency over information. One behavioral anomaly remains: his refusal to discuss crimes that have not been attributed to him. Unlike many serial offenders, Hilton does not appear compelled to claim responsibility for more than what is proven. This restraint may stem from narcissistic calculation, avoiding additional punishment, or it may suggest something else. Was his known victim count the full extent of his crimes, or was it merely the surface of a deeper pattern, one hidden beneath years of transience and silence? Gary Michael Hilton entered the interrogation room like a man arriving for an interview. He was calm, courteous, and responsive. He answered questions with measured clarity, never rushing, never hesitating. His tone was consistent, occasionally philosophical, often abstract. There was no emotional collapse, no denial, no moral reckoning. He approached the conversation not as a suspect under pressure, but as a man offering a curated version of truth, edited, structured, and rehearsed. He framed his actions through a personal logic system. When asked why he killed, he replied that he had no choice, that survival demanded it. He spoke of poverty, desperation, and aging as inevitabilities that closed every other door. According to him, violence was not indulgent but functional, an act of necessity, stripped of cruelty, carried out with reluctant precision. This framing served a dual purpose: to distance himself from sadism and to assert control over the moral narrative. He wanted to be seen not as a monster, but as a man forced into unspeakable acts by circumstance. This tactic is not uncommon among organized killers with antisocial traits. The redefinition of murder as necessary or pragmatic reflects a deeply ingrained cognitive distortion. The offender refuses to acknowledge internal motivations, control, power, resentment, and instead shifts accountability onto external conditions. In doing so, he removes guilt from the equation. He becomes the reluctant executor of fate, not the architect of horror. Hilton also displayed strategic empathy. During several interrogations, he paused to mention the victims' dogs, their kindness, or their appearance. These remarks were not spontaneous. They were calculated insertions of human detail designed to soften perception and distract from his core pathology. In this context, emotional language becomes a form of manipulation, not remorse. He controlled not only his victims, but also the emotional tone of the room, turning interrogators into passive observers of his narrative rather than challengers of it. Psychological assessments conducted during pre-trial procedures confirmed high cognitive function, intact reality testing, and no signs of psychotic disorder. His memory was detailed, his speech coherent, and his behavior free from dissociation, yet his affect remained flat. He described murder as if reporting on weather. The lack of emotional reactivity, coupled with his philosophical detachment, aligns with narcissistic structures built over years of internal justification. When presented with evidence, Hilton neither disputed nor confessed in the traditional sense. He acknowledged the facts, but always through a lens of personal context. His responses were variations of, "That's what happened," or "That's how things went," avoiding direct ownership while never denying the outcome. This language, deliberately neutral, allowed him to maintain psychological distance and protect what remained of his internal framework. In court, Hilton presented himself as cooperative but unrepentant. He waived certain rights strategically. He negotiated his pleas, not from fear, but from calculation. Avoiding the death penalty in Georgia through a plea deal was not an admission of guilt. It was a move to retain control. In Florida, where the death penalty remained active, he adopted a different posture, forcing the state to prove its case. His tactics shifted with the environment, revealing a capacity for adaptive manipulation rooted in a need for dominance over every interaction. Even when sentenced to death, Hilton did not protest. He showed no reaction when the verdict was read. No visible emotion, no appeal to conscience. It was not surrender, it was symmetry. The trial had run its course, and now he returned to silence. But that silence was not empty. He never spoke in detail about other potential victims. He denied nothing, but volunteered nothing. Investigators noted gaps in his timeline, inconsistencies in his travels, and patterns that suggested additional crimes. Yet no confirmation ever came from Hilton. Whether this silence was protective, prideful, or simply strategic remains unresolved. His logic mask remained intact until the end, polished, coherent, and impassive. He never cried, he never lashed out, he never begged. He simply explained, as if the horror he caused was the conclusion of a cold equation he never stopped solving. And beneath that calm exterior, one question remained. Was his silence a final act of control, or the only thing he truly believed he still owned? In a Florida courtroom in 2011, Gary Michael Hilton was sentenced to death. The decision came after weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and witness statements, each reinforcing the portrait of a man who killed not out of impulse, but through systematic choice. The sentence followed life sentences already imposed in Georgia and North Carolina. It marked the judicial end of a criminal trajectory that had crossed multiple states, jurisdictions, and investigative agencies. But for many involved, the legal closure did not translate to psychological resolution. Hilton did not react to the sentence. He neither protested nor expressed remorse. He remained motionless as the judge read the ruling. The lack of emotional response, consistent with his behavior throughout the investigation and trial, suggests an entrenched emotional detachment. This detachment had not only enabled the crimes, but also shaped the aftermath. There was no final confession, no personal reflection, no acknowledgement of pain caused. His silence became the defining act of his final days in public view. For law enforcement, the case left a residue of uncertainty. Patterns in Hilton's movements, financial records, and location history suggested possible links to other unsolved disappearances. He had traveled across remote regions of multiple southern states. His vehicle, a white Chevrolet Astrovan, served as a mobile base of operations. Forensic analysis of the van recovered traces of blood, hair, and DNA. Some matched to known victims, others inconclusive. No additional charges were brought, but the investigative files remained open in several states. Without Hilton's cooperation, those cases stalled in ambiguity. The psychological footprint Hilton left behind extends beyond his immediate crimes. His lifestyle, nomadic, low-tech, and minimally traceable, challenged traditional investigative frameworks. He operated without digital devices, bank accounts, or predictable patterns. His use of public lands as hunting grounds forced a reevaluation of how remote spaces are policed, monitored, and understood. He exploited the public perception of nature as safe and therapeutic, transforming it into a space of isolation and vulnerability. Communities affected by the case experienced a shift in perception. Trailheads, once seen as gateways to freedom, became associated with uncertainty. Park rangers and local law enforcement agencies began re-examining cold cases involving missing hikers. The presence of a predator who functioned beneath the threshold of visibility altered how risk was calculated in rural environments. Hilton's crimes did not provoke mass fear, but rather a quiet erosion of trust in the perceived safety of solitude. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, Hilton represents a specific threat profile: a mobile, high-functioning offender with control-oriented motives and a pragmatic, detached worldview. He did not seek fame, ritual, or recognition. He did not escalate in brutality, but maintained consistency in method and execution. This consistency indicates a personality organized around utility rather than compulsion. He killed when the opportunity aligned with need, not when desire overwhelmed restraint. The absence of sadistic escalation challenges assumptions about serial violence, suggesting that not all serial killers follow patterns of increasing cruelty. Some, like Hilton, plateau in method, efficient, repeatable, and unrepentant. His final years were spent in isolation on death row, largely silent. No interviews, no books, no letters. Unlike many high-profile offenders, he did not attempt to build a mythos around his actions. He vanished from the public narrative as efficiently as he once vanished into the woods. Only the victims' families, investigators, and behavioral specialists continued to speak his name, most often in connection with the unanswered questions he left behind. The case of Gary Michael Hilton remains one of the rare examples where a criminal's psychological interior is both legible and incomplete. His logic was visible, but his motivation remained opaque. His actions were coherent, but their emotional depth was missing. He existed at the intersection of survivalism, antisocial adaptation, and predatory control. Ultimately, Hilton's legacy is not in the number of his crimes, but in the manner of his existence. He proved that a man could drift through forests and forgotten roads, driven by calculated necessity, unnoticed until it was too late. The van he lived in became both a tool and a symbol. A self-contained world where control could be absolute and where consequences, for a time, felt distant. In the years since his conviction, hikers still disappear. Some are found, others are not. Investigations continue, but the specter of a man with a red dog and no fixed address lingers in the memory of those who study crime and those who walk the trails. Hilton may be locked away, but the psychological structure he inhabited, detached, efficient, and hidden in plain sight, remains. His silence, in the end, may speak more clearly than any confession.